Good evening, everyone. This is Donald again. It is Monday, March 16, 2020 at about 8:15 p.m. Hope everybody is well. I'm doing fine. I'm just at home with the virus things and the San Francisco Bay Area preparing to get locked down in the next few hours. I'm actually decided to do this recording early, and instead of focusing on how my day was, I came up with the idea of talking about St. Mary's Chinese Day School sports history. The reason for discussing that is because Demetrius Chokas, probably the best known AD out of St. Mary's, passed away recently from cancer. And I thought, especially with the school, St. Mary's Chinese closing, the day school at least closing recently, be good to have some history of how the sports program restarted, how things went, and whatnot, and my involvement with it. So hopefully this will be a good piece of history for those who coached or played at St. Mary's. So let me know what you think. But before I get into the sports history, let me talk about my background with St. Mary's. A lot of people mistakenly think I went to St. Mary's from like kindergarten to 8th grade, and most kids who go to St. Mary's usually go through all 8 years. But unfortunately, I was not one of those. I actually attended Commodore Stockton Elementary School, which was also in Chinatown, from kindergarten to 5th grade. And then after I left Commodore Stockton, I could have gone to Ben Franklin Middle School near Japantown in San Francisco, but instead my parents decided to send me to St. Mary's instead. I'll be honest, it was probably not my first choice to go to St. Mary's. Obviously, being from a public school, adapting to a Catholic school / private school where you have to wear uniforms and whatnot was a bit of a challenge, a little bit different. Also, I wasn't really one of the cool kids at St. Mary's, so my experiences there were a little bit mixed. I've told my classmates that is nothing new, but I have no regrets. Because there were some positives out of it, especially considering that I got to get involved with the St. Mary's sports programs during my time at St. Mary's, and that was one of the actual positives. So that's a good segue into the initial background of how St. Mary's sports, at least in one of our newspaper articles in the Aurora newsletter, said St. Mary's Saints, a new beginning. I believe St. Mary's had a sports program back in the old days. I don't know how far back. I do know St. Mary's did inspire a adult team called the San Francisco Saints that traveled around and played in a bunch of tournaments and existed all the way up until the 1990s. But I'm not really focused on that part. I'm just focusing on the actual school portion. So for me, going to St. Mary's, I went, like I mentioned, after 5th grade from Commodore to St. Mary's. So I was there from 6th to 8th grade. We actually did not have sports in our 6th and 7th grade years. I think there was some attempt to do some baseball and whatnot. I don't remember a whole lot except that we did practice. But sports really kicked in back around the fall of 1987. We had a new teacher who started teaching at our school. His name was Mr. Jim or James O'Grady. He was actually a teacher formerly from Epiphany School out in the Crocker Amazon, near the Mission District. And Mr. O'Grady came in one day and just said, "Hey, I noticed you guys don't have any sports programs," and asked the class at that time, our 8th grade class, if we were interested in forming a basketball team. And we're like, "Okay, that's cool. We'll go ahead and form a team." We had no idea what we were getting into. So we formed a team probably, I want to say maybe November. Can't quite remember the dates. But we formed a team, and we, after maybe a few practices, jumped right into a scrimmage against St. Bridget at the St. Bridget gym, which no longer exists. I think it's owned by the one of the colleges. I think it's a Golden Gate University or one of those, or maybe the Academy of Art University. I can't quite remember who owns it now. We played there, and then we jumped into the Flame Tournament, where we played St. Gabriel and St. Anne, I want to say. We lost both games. We had a good game against St. Gabriel, which we tied at the last second, but ultimately lost in overtime. One of the memories of that game was after the game, we got into an argument with the team. And to be perfectly honest, not to really get into too much racial stuff and whatnot, but, back then was a different time for Asians and Chinese. Some of the kids and some of the fans and whatnot, had said some racist stuff, which I still remember to this day, because our coach got into it with the fans, and we started talking back to the St. Gabriel team a little bit. So those are interesting days. But, that was the start of our season. I lost all 3 games, and then we later on jumped into the CYL season in 1988, around January. As a whole, our team didn't do that well. We finished, I believe, with 2 wins and a total of 9 losses. We went 2-6 in league. During that time, I remember some of the games we played. We played our first game at Sacred Heart Cathedral's old gym, not the current new gym that maybe more folks are familiar with. We traveled and played at Epiphany. We played at what was back then All Hallows, which is now the Bayview YMCA. We traveled to St. Peter Pacifica. We played at St. Monica. A lot of different places. And also, I like to mention from a historical perspective that we were probably one of the last few St. Mary's teams to play without a three-point line. Even though I think the lines exist at the gym, three-pointers were not really implemented at the CYL level until maybe a year or 2 later. It's just interesting, which would have been useful for us because we lost a few games by 3 points, or even 2 points or 1 point because we hit a shot, but we didn't have a chance to shoot a three-pointer, which was bad. And then after basketball season ended, we actually went to play baseball. The girls went with girls basketball. The schedule was similar to what the current CYL does. My baseball season was cut short when I had a bad accident at the Chinese playground in Chinatown, and I had a concussion, and I was out for the season. But the girls played as well. I forget how our baseball team did. I think the girls may have won 1 game. So that first year, which would have been all of our 8th graders last year, I think we had 1 7th grader on the team, was, from a record perspective, not particularly good. But fortunately, my mom, bless her soul, kept a lot of the newsletters and stuff, the school newsletter that we had, or newspaper that we published internally, and also the school newsletter that got sent out to the school, all the parents and stuff. And we had articles about our baseball team, basketball teams and stuff, and I kept some of the basketball stuff, so I have some actual history of our team. And I actually even, thanks to Ben Legier, who was the CYL administrator for boys basketball, I even got copies of our schedule, not our schedule, but copies of our records and some of the other scheduling stuff, like the playoffs and how teams did. So I had that around somewhere. I don't know if I've misplaced that part of it, but I had some history, so it was good. And that basically, our class of 1988, St. Mary's, was the first revival of the St. Mary's sports program. After we graduated in 1988-89, the program continued. I think Mr. O'Grady was still there, and he put in some teams. He had a 8th grade team. So the guy, one of the guys who was a 7th grader during our year was an 8th grader now. So he and his class ended up playing in 8th grade. And me and my friend Wilbur Wong, ended up coaching a 5th grade team. I think there was another 6th grade team as well. I think the girls also had a 5th grade team. I forget if baseball's involved. I was just primarily focused on coaching at that point. The recollections of the year after us during the continuation years, especially in 89, was that the 8th grade team, who was playing in the lowest division at the time, actually ended up winning the championship. Good for them. I remember being at the championship game, which they played at Sacred Heart Cathedral. The team I was coaching with Wilbur, I think we went 500, 4-4. Didn't do great, but, it was fun. Good for the guys to play that first year and whatnot. And then I was not really helping with the girls at that point. I was around, but didn't really, I think I watched some games. I forget if I was assistant coaching. It's been a while. But anyway, but the fact is there were teams around, and the program was continuing on. And it looked like, hey, the program would continue indefinitely moving forward, right, with Mr. O'Grady at the helm. However, fast forward a little bit, I think Mr. O'Grady, the year after, this was going to the next year, which would have been the 1989-90 season, the 3rd year, Mr. O'Grady, maybe due to commute, maybe whatever reason, I think he left the school as a teacher and then as administrator and, of course, as the athletic director. So from that point in 1990 to about, for the next, probably that year and the year after, the sports program was administered by just the principal, which I believe was Mr. Vandro, if I remember correctly. Could have been his name, could have been something else. There's a whole bunch of names that are running around my head. I don't quite remember. In any case, the program still continued, but it was done by the principal. And at that point, for at least those couple of years, the program was strictly focused on 6th, 7th, and 8th grade classes. CYO offers sports all the way from 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th, 8th grade. But St. Mary's, for whatever reason, decided that they would only go with 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So there were no little kids playing. So teams were coming in during 6th, 7th, and 8th grade for St. Mary's, especially at the 6th grade level, a little bit of disadvantage having not played organized. But we did the best we could for those couple of years. My friend Wilbur and I remained coaching during the initial season with the principal taking over during 1990, and we actually won the championship as well. I think the girls team that year, I don't remember the girls played. Like I said, lots of stuff I don't remember. But regardless, we coached. We won that championship, which was fun that year in 1990. And then me and Wilbur continued on with that particular class, which was the class of 1992 at St. Mary's for all the way through until they graduated in 8th grade. Unfortunately, that championship we won in 6th grade would be the only one we would have in 7th and 8th grade. With our team specifically, we didn't do too well the next couple of seasons. There were other teams that did win, which was good. I think Larry Wong, who was my classmate at St. Mary's, ended up coaching a team that won during their 7th grade year, which would have been, I think, during the 92 season. His team was in 7th grade. I think they won that year, if I recall correctly. So that covers the initial beginnings or revival of the St. Mary's program from about 1987-ish when we, with Mr. O'Grady, on till with the principal running the program till about the 90-91 season. Unbeknownst to most of us, in the beginning of the fall of 91, which would lead into the 92 season, that was the last year, there would be a change, and a very good change for the St. Mary's program. That was the year Mr. Chokas, or Mr. Demetrius Chokas, was asked to take over the St. Mary's program. I forget, Mr. Chokas may have told me this story. I can't remember explicitly, but somehow the principal at St. Mary's maybe got acquainted with Mr. Chokas through his work at NDV, and maybe he found Chokas to be a really energetic and nice guy, which he was, and decided, hey, Mr. Chokas, can you just take over the sports program? So Chokas took over. I didn't really know. I wasn't doing much volleyball at the time. I was just a fan, so I was watching the volleyball, the girls' volleyball team play, which they won a championship in fall of 91. And then I somehow got introduced to Mr. Chokas, and I tried to talk to him about getting our team set up for tournaments and whatnot. So my early experience with Chokas, and I don't know if others from my time at the coaching, which includes Larry and Wilbur and maybe others, how they felt about Chokas. I didn't really know much about Mr. Chokas. Didn't really know him that well at that time. But, you know, he ran the program. We had some award stuff, and we just moved on. And then it was after maybe a couple of years later when I started to get Chokas more. But during that time, from when Chokas took over in 91, I coached through 92. Then me and Wilbur continued on with another team in 92, 93. It wasn't until I started coaching my own team, which would have been in 1994, with my boys basketball team, ultimately the class of 96, where I actually got to talk to Chokas and understand him a lot better. To me, at least during the early years, Chokas was just simply, hey, just an administrator, just some guy running the program, don't really talk to him much. We just kind of, you know, to be honest, our coaches and teams did our own thing. The other teams did their own thing. We weren't particularly unified. You know, we just kind of coached our teams and just finished and moved on. But got to give Chokas some credit, Mr. Chokas, that is. He maybe wanted to take his time, get a lay of the land, understand how the program was doing. He ultimately did convince St. Mary's, the school, and the administration to allow him to introduce sports at the lower grade levels, meaning from 3rd grade onward. So I can't remember explicitly the year. My notes say it might have been in 1997. Could have been earlier, but I say at least 97. Definitely by 98, because by 1998 I was coaching a third grade girls team. That Mr. Chokas had introduced sports at the lower grade levels. He introduced volleyball, basketball, boys and girls. I don't think he did baseball. I may have, I can't remember, but definitely volleyball for the girls, boys basketball, and girls basketball, and maybe a little bit of soccer. St. Mary's soccer interest was not that high, so I think Chokas may have gotten kids to play soccer a little bit with NDV kids instead. He just had, merged some of the St. Mary's kids that were interested to NDV, if I recall correctly. So when St. Mary's started having sports for the little kids, that's when the program really took off. I call it the prime time or peak years. Interest was at its highest between that time, around 97, 98, all the way till about 2003, 2004, whatever. At that point, I'll talk about the later years toward the end here. But, the boys' teams were competitive. The girls' teams were competitive. It introduced a lot of community, especially for the little kids at the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade levels. We ended up playing a lot of home games at NDV. Since St. Mary's did not have a gym, we used NDV as the home gym, and the gym was small, so only the little kids could play there. But generally, the St. Mary's teams would all play, sometimes on the same day or night. Sometimes Friday night, 3 teams would be playing 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, or sometimes they would be playing close to the same times on Saturdays. And to be honest, it was a fun time for all of us. Me, Wilbur, and Larry were coaching, as well as other coaches for the other teams. And, those are fun nights and fun days. We would go out when at all possible. If we were coaching, we would stay and watch the other teams play. If we weren't coaching, we would come down and watch the teams go out there. It was a great community time. And to this day, me and Wilbur still hang out. I see Larry every now and then. I saw Chokas out every now and then before he passed away. A lot of the kids who played during that time still remember me, say hi. I talk to a bunch of them. I see coaches around. I see parents around, still say hi. I mean, those are some great times. And we got to give Chokas credit for instilling some pride in St. Mary's and in the program. Another key thing that Chokas did, which was cool, was he introduced a jamboree between the NDV teams and St. Mary's once a year. A lot of other schools do it in CYO. I think Holy Name and St. Cecilia do a yearly jamboree where the teams all play each other, just for fun. Mission Dolores and St. Thomas Apostle, I think, used to do it. I don't know if they still do it now. So those are cool things to do. To be fair, from a basketball perspective, at least NDV, especially on the boys' side, was generally better than St. Mary's and for most of the teams. But the girls, for St. Mary's, depending on the team, some teams were better than others. NDV had some advantages. I know my team that I had from 1998 to 2000 were better than my NDV counterparts. But, that's the way things go sometimes. So those were fun years, and we maintained it for quite a few years, maybe until 2000, 2001. I can't quite remember the years, but we had it for a few years, and those were fun. And even though from an NDV perspective, I wasn't a coach at NDV, at least at that time, a lot of kids still remember me. And I've had guys who are like in their 30s who come on and say, hey, didn't you ref or a CYO or a coach at St. Mary's? And I say, oh, yeah. And he says, oh, yeah, I remember you. You're an NDV kid. So, those are good times, man. A lot of memories from both the St. Mary's side and also some of the NDV kids that I know that I've run into all over the place. So those are some great years. And then specifically for me, my time at St. Mary's ended in 2000. I coached with Wilbur in 1988 or so till 2000. My reason for stepping away was I've given a lot of volunteer time. It was literally volunteer time. And I was a little bit burnt out. I had gotten into the working world. I was getting a little stressed out trying to coach the teams. Even though I love my last team, I wish I could have taken them to a championship. I ended up giving them up in 2000. Though I followed their exploits, the next few years after, well, my particular kids, I had given them after 5th grade, but the next year they played while in 6th grade with the 7th graders who had lost some of their players. So my kids played 2 years with another class, and then their own with their own team in 8th grade, and they deservedly won a couple of championships, both in their last couple of years, which was good. I wish I could have done it, but it was all right. And that ended my involvement pretty much with St. Mary's. I stopped as a coach in 2000, and then I watched my team play until 2003, until they graduated. And then basically I, to be frank, lost interest in St. Mary's sports. I was busy with work and other things. And it was around that time also the reign of Chokas effectively ended. I don't know the whole story. I think maybe there were some conflicts with administrators at the school. I don't really know the full story. But ultimately, Mr. Chokas stepped away and handed the reins over to one of our alums, the class of 99, Brian Chung. I didn't know Brian too well at the time, but Brian kept the program running. He did well. So I can't remember what year Brian took over, maybe 2003, 2004, whatever the year he took over. And he ran it for another 7 years or so. Did a great job. He took the program in places that Mr. Chokas would not have. Brian did a lot of highlights and did a lot of YouTube videos and all of that, and gave another visual to St. Mary's, and especially with St. Mary's School struggling with enrollment due to a lot of different reasons we won't get into. The enthusiasm for sports was still good with Brian taking over. And he did a great job, to be honest. And I don't know a whole lot about Brian's work except for what I saw on the outside. But from what I saw on the outside, from his videos and watching some games, the kids loved him, and he did a good job, probably just as well as Chokas, and probably even better because of Brian's ability to do videos and cut highlights and whatnot. He gave a lot of public exposure to the St. Mary's program. And then after a while, Brian quit. I want to say 2011, 2012, whatever year he quit. And there was a new AD for a couple of years. And then unfortunately, due to lack of enrollment, the Archdiocese ultimately shut the school down. And the school, there was some hope the school would come back, but it hasn't, and it looks like it may not, which is unfortunate. And the reason for why I wanted to record this, and it's a bit rambling, apologies, was that, Chokas passed away, and with the school closing and, everybody kind of moving on, this history has never really been documented. And so I figured some vocal history would be great. And also, I was told during Mr. Chokas' his rosary service the day before his funeral, I was asked to go speak, but I had already left early. I had something to do, so I couldn't share some of this history. So I figured, let me share some of this history about St. Mary's, about my involvement, about different people's involvement, Mr. Chokas' involvement, Brian's involvement, Brian Chung's, and just get it down there. Because you know what? It was a fun time. For me, being part of the initial revival, being one of the early coaches with Larry and Wilbur, having Mr. Chokas come in, take the program to one level, and then having Brian come in, keep what Chokas was doing, and also add an additional layer of technology and video. Even though the school is closed and it may not come back and the program is dead for now, it was a good time. It was a very good, I don't know, I can't remember what year the school closed, but a good 20 plus years, give or take, or maybe 30 years or so of a program. It's unfortunate. I wish it would continue on, but if it's not meant to come back, it's okay. We had a good run, everyone. So I'll wrap up here by just saying thanks to everyone that's listening. Hopefully you're a St. Mary's parent, St. Mary's grad, maybe a player, maybe a coach. But a lot of thanks to Mr. James O'Grady, who was our teacher during my time and kind of restarted St. Mary's. Thanks to the St. Mary's administrators who gave Mr. O'Grady and the other athletic directors in the future the ability to allow them to introduce sports to St. Mary's. Thanks to Mr. Chokas for helping us out, get the program into a good spot and improving it. And of course, big thanks to Brian for doing it very well after Chokus. I didn't know the last AD at all, but give him some thanks for trying to take over before the school closed. And of course, a great thanks to, I'm sure the school has thanked us via trophies and whatnot, but thanks to all the coaches. Most of us didn't get paid, or I don't think any of us got paid. We were all volunteers. But it was fun times out there. And, I wish I could go back in time and enjoy it again, because, it was great community, great people to hang out with. And I'll always remember my time as a St. Mary's player and as a coach. And also, personally, thanks to all my teams that I coached. Both as an assistant with Wilbur, class of 1992 boys, 1992 girls for basketball, class of 96 boys for basketball, class of 1995 girls for volleyball and basketball, class of 1997 girls for basketball, and the class of 2003 for basketball. I loved all my teams. I enjoyed my time coaching. I wasn't always the easiest coach to work with, but those are some great times. In any case, I've gone on for quite a while now. Hope you enjoyed the history, look back at St. Mary's. Give me some comments. If I missed anything, let me know. I can talk more about stuff, or if you have any questions, feel free to ping me. Other than that, it's 8:45 or it's 8:40. Be safe out there with the virus things. Take care of yourself, and I hope to talk to all you guys soon. Take care now.